Assalamualaikum and good day, everyone. I am Dr. Khairunur Fairuz Azman from the Department of Physiology, School of Medical Sciences, University Science Malaysia. So today I'll be discussing manuscript writing for scientific publication, specifically focusing on how we move from an initial draft to a manuscript that is acceptable for publication. Many of us here are already involved in research, whether at postgraduate level or as lecturers. We generate data, we conduct the studies, and we produce the results. But one of the biggest challenges is not doing the research. It is actually communicating that research effectively in the form of a manuscript. So this is where many of us fail. Not because the science is weak, but because the writing, the structure, or the positioning is not strong enough. Many manuscripts are rejected at an early stage, sometimes even before peer review. So in this session, I will focus on what actually matters when you are preparing a manuscript for submission. So by the end of this session, you should be able to understand what journals and reviewers actually expect when they evaluate a manuscript. This is important because many authors write based on what they think is correct, but not necessarily based on how papers are judged during submission and peer review. And secondly, you should be able to apply the IMRED structure effectively. That is introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Not just knowing the structure, but understanding the role of each section and how they connect with each other. And third, you should be able to identify and avoid common mistakes that often lead to rejection. This include issues such as poor writing clarity, unclear research positioning, and journal mismatch. Before we go into a manuscript structure, it is important to briefly distinguish between two main types of scientific papers. The first is the original research. This is what most of us are usually writing. It is data driven. It involves primary data collection, whether experimental, clinical, or computational. It is typically hypothesis driven and it follows the standard IMRED structure. In an original research paper, your goal is very clear. You are answering a specific research question using your own data. The second type is the review article. A review does not present new experimental data, but it analyzes and integrates existing literature. But one critical point, a review paper is not just a summary. A good review must synthesize information, compare findings, identify gaps, and provide a clear perspective or direction. So a simple way to think about it is original research answers a question with data. A review answers a question but with interpretation. So for today's session, the focus will be mainly on original research manuscript because they are more commonly required for theses and publications. Before we move into the structure of a manuscript, it is important to understand what actually makes a paper publishable. In general, a strong manuscript is built on three key elements. The first is clear research gap. You must be able to identify what is missing in the current literature and define the specific question your study is addressing. Many papers are rejected early because this gap is not clearly articulated. If the reader cannot understand what your study is needed, then the rest of the paper becomes less convincing. The second element is strong methodology. Your study design, sample size, procedures, and statistical analysis must be appropriate and also robust to support your conclusions. This is the foundation of your work. If the methodology is weak or unclear, reviewers will not have confidence in your findings, regardless of how interesting your results may be. And the third element is compelling narrative. A good manuscript is not just a collection of data. It should have a logical flow, moving clearly from the problem to the findings and then to the implications. The reader should be able to follow your argument easily without confusion. So these three elements are closely interconnected. Clearly defined gaps guides your methodology, and your methodology generates results that fit into a coherent narrative. If one of the elements is weak, it affects the overall strength of the manuscript. Now let me shift perspective. That was how you think as an author, but this is how reviewers evaluate your paper. They will ask, is the research question important? Does the study addresses something meaningful, or is it simply repeating what is already known? And then they will ask, is the methodology valid? Reviewers want to know whether the study design, your sample size, and analysis are strong enough to support the conclusions. And then, are the results clearly presented? Are the conclusions supported by data? Is the manuscript clear and logically structured? So, if your paper can satisfy all of these questions, then it has a high chance to be published. The standard structure used in most scientific manuscripts is IMRED, which stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. So each section has a very specific role. They answers different questions. The introduction answers the question why this study is needed. It sets it defines the research gap. So in this section, you should define your research gap and why your study is needed. The method section answer how. How was your study conducted? The results section answer what. What did you find? And the discussion answers so what. So what do these findings mean? This is where you interpret your result and explain the significance of your results. So one of the most common mistake in manuscript writing is mixing content between the section. You mix between sections. For example, you interpret results in the results section. Interpreting results should be in discussion, so not in results section. Results section, you just mention the results, but interpreting should be in discussion. And another example is including excessive background information in the discussion. So background information or literature review should be in discussion, in introduction, not in the discussion. Discussion, you just discuss your results. Any literature review should be in the introduction. So you should not mix content between sections. And importantly, you should always follow the IMRED structure for clarity and impact. Now let's take a look at the title and abstract, which are often underestimated but extremely important. The title should be specific, informative, and clearly reflect the key elements of your study. Ideally, it should include the main variables and, where relevant, the study design. And you should avoid vague wording and unnecessary abbreviations because this will reduce clarity and searchability. And the abstract follows a structured format, background, objective, and then methods, results, and conclusion. So each part should be concise but informative. The background, meaning that you will set the context briefly, and the objective, you state whether what are the study aim. And for methods, you summarize how the study was conducted. The results should present the key findings, preferably with actual data rather than general statements. So you should put your actual data. And the conclusion should reflect the main implications of the study. So abstract should have all of this. But in reality, editors often decide within seconds whether to continue reading based on the title and abstract. In some cases, the abstract alone determines whether the paper proceeds to peer review or not. So this section is not just a summary. It is your first opportunity to communicate the value of your work effectively. So a strong title and abstract can attract attention, whereas a weak one can lead to immediate rejection, regardless of the quality of your study. If your study is good, but your title and abstract is weak, then it is immediate rejection, probably. The introduction is where you establish the foundation of the study. A simple way to structure it is in three steps. First, what is already known. So here you briefly introduce the topic and highlight key findings from previous studies. But you need to keep this focus. You do not need to include everything, just the important one. Second, what is missing. This is the most important part. You need to clearly show what is not yet understood or what problems still exist. So this is what we call the research gap. Third, what you will do. So here you state your objective and explain how your study is going to address that gap. A common issue is that the introduction becomes too descriptive. Many authors spend too much time explaining what is already known, but do not clearly explain what is missing. So, when writing your introduction, always make sure that the reader can clearly see why your study is needed. And then it follows by the method section, which explain how you carried out your study. So in this section, you should describe your study design, your sample size, what procedures you use, and how you analyze the data. And if there is ethical approval, you should also mention it. The key idea here is clarity. The reader should be able to understand what you did. And you don't need to include every small detail, but you should include enough information so that someone else could do the same methods that you did. And a common issue is either not detail, which makes the study unclear, or too much unnecessary detail, which makes it hard to read. So it should be balanced, not too much, but not too little. And one important point to remember is that weak methods cannot be rescued by strong results. So if the study design or analysis is not appropriate, then it will affect how reviewers interpret your findings. So you need to keep it clear, structured, and focus on what is important. The results section is where you present your findings. So here the focus is on showing the data clearly and in a logical order. You can use tables or figures to help communicate the results more effectively. But you should avoid repeating the same data in different formats. Do not present the same results in both a table and a figure. All right, choose the format that communicates the data more clearly. And one important point is to avoid interpretation in this section. You are presenting what you found only, not explaining what it means yet. The interpretation will come in the discussion. So the aim of this results section is clarity. The reader should be able to understand your key findings easily. Next is a discussion. The discussion section is where you explain what your results mean. A simple way to organize this section is to start with your key findings and then relate them with existing studies. You can discuss whether your results are similar or different, and then you can suggest possible reasons why they are similar or why they are different. And after that, you can explain the possible mechanisms or explanations of the results, and then followed by implications of the findings. It is also important to acknowledge limitations. No study is perfect, so being transparent about limitation will actually strengthen your paper. And one useful way to think about this section is that this is where your contribution becomes clear. So you need to keep the discussion focused, logical, and link back to your research question. So this is where your paper is often accepted or rejected. The reviewers will judge whether you are only just reporting results or whether you are actually interpreting their meaning. So this is where you demonstrate your intellectual contribution. So that was the IMRED structure: introduction, methods, results, and discussion. But when you are actually writing, which section should you write first? Should you follow the flow, start with introduction and then method, results, and discussion? No, that is going to be harder. A practical approach is actually not to write the paper in that order. You can actually first start with methods. and then results, because these are the most straightforward. You already have this information, so it is easier to write. And then after methods and results, you create your figures and tables. So because this will help you see your data clearly before you start interpreting it. And then after that, you move to discussion. And here in the discussion, you explain what the findings mean. And then after discussion, only you write the introduction and then the abstract. Because at this stage, you have a full understanding of your study. So it becomes easier to explain the context and to summarize your work. So this approach can actually make the writing process more manageable, especially when you are just starting. So don't worry if you feel like you don't want to write the paper in order they are supposed to appear in the paper, because actually following this strategy is easier. Now I want to highlight some common reasons why manuscripts are rejected. One common issue is no novelty or a lack of clear contribution. If it is not clear what your study adds to the existing literature, then reviewers may question the importance of your study, because this means that your study is not needed because someone else has already done it. And another reason is poor writing clarity. That means your writing is unclear or confusing. You should present your data clearly, and your sentences should also be clear. Another reason is weak methodology. So if the study design or analysis is not appropriate, it affects confidence in the results, and your results may not be reliable. Overinterpretation is another issue. This happens when conclusions go beyond what the data actually supports. So you should not overinterpret your results. And finally, journal mismatch. Sometimes a paper is submitted to a journal that is not the right fit in terms of scope or audience of the journal. What you should do is by choosing the right journal from the beginning. Journal selection actually is not something to think about at the end after you have done writing. No, it should be considered early in the writing process because it can help you how to write your manuscript. When selecting a journal, you first look at the scope of the journal. Make sure your study fits clearly within what the journal published. And you should also consider the journal's impact factor and acceptance rate. It is good to aim high, but it is also important to be realistic, especially for early submissions when we are just starting to write a paper. So it is important to be realistic. It is also helpful to avoid submitting to a journal that is clearly outside your field, even if it has high impact factor. But if it's not within the scope of the journal, then it is immediate rejection. So a good fit is more important than just aiming for a high impact journal. And secondly, you should look at the type of article they accept. Some journals prefer clinical studies, some prefer experimental work, and other may prioritize review article more than original articles. So a useful tip is to look at recently published papers that are similar to your work. So this will give you a better idea on whether your study fits and also what level of detail or style that the journal expects. And another point is to check the author guidelines carefully. This is important. So you should, before you submit to the journal, then you should check their author guidelines. In that author guidelines, they will tell you the formatting, the word limit, the structure, because this thing is vary between journals. Journals A will differ from journal B. So each time you submit a paper, then you should refer to the author guidelines, because if you don't follow it, it can lead to immediate rejection. And finally, always think about your target audience. Ask yourself who would benefit most from your findings and choose a journal that reach that audience. If you take some time choosing the right journal from the beginning, you can actually save some time later, because you will reduce the chances of rejection and resubmission. Because if you need to resubmit to another journal, then you need to do the same thing all over again. So might as well do it right at the beginning. To summarize the key points from this session, first, clarity is your strongest advantage. It means your paper should be easy to read and easy to understand because reviewers should not have to guess what you are trying to say. Your paper should be clear. Second, structure determines impact. So this refer how your ideas are organized. So even good results can lose their impact if the paper is not structured clearly. So your structure is important. Your paper needs to be structured logically according to the flow. And third, writing is rewriting, meaning that writing is a process. So the first draft is always not perfect. You need to revise, edit a lot of time before it can be perfect. So nothing can be right at the first time. You need to keep on writing and writing, rewrite, edit, revise until then it will probably be perfect. And finally, think like a reviewer. It means that you should look at your own paper critically. Ask yourself whether your research is clear, whether your methods are appropriate, and whether your conclusions are supported by your data. So if you keep these points in mind, then it will help you produce manuscripts that are clearer, more organized, and more likely to be accepted. So thank you for your attention. I hope this session provides a clearer view for writing and improving your manuscripts. Thank you.